Imagine waking up tomorrow in Tudor England, sometime between 1485 and 1603. You're penniless, unknown, and desperate for work. Your options. You could stand knee-deep in fermented human urine for 12 straight hours. You might become a noble whose main responsibility is monitoring the king's bowel movements and wiping his royal backside. Or, if fate truly hates you, you'll land the night shift crawling into cesspits filled with suffocating toxic gas, the kind that killed more than a few unlucky workers, including one poor soul named Richard the Raker, who went in and never came out. In this video, you're about to uncover 12 jobs from Tudor England that were so revolting, so dangerously absurd, they'll make your worst day at work look like a spa retreat. And no, I'm not exaggerating. One of these jobs literally involved tracking the shape and frequency of the king's poop, and people actually competed for it. Welcome to a time when occupational hazards meant drowning in human waste, when foot injuries came from standing in ammonia-rich urine, and when your only job perk was keeping the dead rats you stumbled across. These aren't twisted urban legends. These were real jobs performed by real people, day after day, generation after generation, in a world that knew nothing of labor laws, safety standards, or even basic human dignity. Number 12. The Handpin Maker. At first glance, making pins doesn't sound so bad. In fact, compared to medieval cesspits and plague houses, it almost seems peaceful. But that illusion vanishes the moment you step into the suffocating, dust-choked workshop of a Tudor-era handpin maker. You see, back then, pins weren't mass-produced by machines. Every single one, yes, every pin, was crafted by hand through an exhausting, repetitive, 18-step process. Workers began by straightening lengths of brass wire by hand, cutting them to size, then carefully sharpening one end with a file. Then came the head, a tiny loop of wire, hammered flat into place. After that, the pins were dumped into sacks of brown and chalk dust and shaken manually for hours to polish them. It sounds tedious, but the toll it took was far worse than boredom. The air in those workshops was thick with brass particles and chalk residue. Every breath was a dose of poison. Workers developed what was called brass founder's ague, likely heavy metal poisoning from constant inhalation of fine metallic dust. Their eyes, strained by the delicate, close-up work in poor lighting, often failed by their 40s. Their hands twisted with arthritis. Their backs curved and locked from endless hours hunched over their benches. A skilled pin maker might produce as many as 4,000 pins in a single day, meaning they repeated those motions thousands of times daily, without breaks, without rest, without protection. And it wasn't just adults doing this. Whole families were pulled into the trade, including children as young as 4 or 5. Their small fingers were considered ideal for the delicate tasks. By age 10, they were expected to handle the entire process on their own. By 30, they were often half-blind and physically broken, discarded and replaced by younger hands. It was a brutal cycle of quiet suffering, generation after generation. All for the tiny metal fasteners that held together Tudor clothing. Eventually, industrialization swept away the pin-making trade. Machines took over, and the hand pin maker disappeared from the workforce. But for over 300 years, this seemingly harmless job quietly consumed its workers, one pin, one breath, one broken body at a time. Number 11. The Dog Whipper. If you thought church in Tudor England was a quiet, sacred affair, think again. Picture this. It's Sunday morning, the pews are packed, the priest is delivering a solemn sermon, and chaos reigns as dogs run wild in the aisles. Lapdogs bark at sheepdogs, hunting hounds chase each other under benches, and somewhere in the back, a massive mastiff is lifting its leg on a sacred column. Enter the dog whipper, a man employed specifically to maintain order in God's house, not among the people, but among their unruly pets. Armed with a long leather whip and a pair of wooden tongs, the dog whipper patrolled the church like a medieval bouncer, ready to crack down on canine disruption. A bark. Crack of the whip. 2 terriers fighting. Out come the tongs. But here's where things got complicated. The dog whipper's authority wasn't limited to animals. If children misbehaved, young lovers got too cozy, or someone nodded off during the sermon, they too might feel the sting of the lash. This wasn't just a job, it was a tightrope walk between discipline and disaster. Strike the wrong dog, say the squire's prized hunting hound, and you risked more than your employment. There are recorded cases of dog whippers being attacked by furious nobles, mauled by angry pets, and publicly humiliated by parishioners who didn't appreciate their judgment being questioned mid-sermon. And yet, despite the risk, this bizarre role lasted for centuries. The position was often passed down through generations and persisted well into the Victorian era. In some communities, the dog whipper was even seen as a symbol of moral authority, equal parts enforcer and entertainer. Still, it was far from glamorous. Standing for hours in a stuffy, overcrowded church, constantly alert, fending off biting dogs and irate owners, all for a handful of coins and no respect. The decline of this profession came only when social norms evolved and people stopped bringing their animals to church. But for hundreds of years, dog whippers stood at the uneasy intersection of holiness and havoc, whipping their way through the Lord's day in the name of discipline, order, and a little peace and quiet. Number 10. The executioner's assistant. When we imagine Tudor executions, we picture the dramatic climax, the drumroll, the solemn crowd, the clean slice of the axe followed by a gasp and maybe a prayer. But that grim spectacle didn't just happen on its own. Behind the executioner stood another figure, quieter but essential, the assistant, sometimes called the headsman. This wasn't just a sidekick with a mop. His job began long before the prisoner took the final walk. He sharpened the axe to terrifying precision, testing it to ensure it wouldn't chip on the block or, worse, fail to decapitate cleanly. A dull edge meant disaster, a botched beheading, screams, a second or third blow. During the execution, it was often the assistant who bound the prisoner's hands, positioned their trembling body on the block, and in some cases, physically held them steady while death hovered just inches away. But if that sounds grim, the real horror came after the axe fell. The assistant was the one who retrieved the severed head, often still dripping, and began the gruesome task of preserving it. Heads weren't always buried, they were boiled with salt and cumin to keep them from rotting, then coated in tar to extend their shelf life. The final destination. Public display, mounted on pikes atop bridges and city gates as a warning to all. Yes, there was a literal recipe for preparing heads, and the assistant followed it like a butcher with a cookbook. And if you think that was the worst of it, consider that simple beheading was a luxury. For high treason, the assistant had to help with hangings, live disembowelments, beheadings, and even a quartering of bodies. Limbs were hacked off, organs removed, each step falling to the assistant's blood-stained hands. While the executioner held symbolic status, often feared and respected, the assistant was the one up to his elbows in human carnage, earning far less and receiving none of the notoriety. His role evolved slightly over time as executions became more humane, but the core task, handling the messy, violent logistics of state-sanctioned death, remained the same. To be an executioner's assistant was to live each day beside the machinery of fear, with death as your coworker, and the worst parts of humanity as your daily assignment. Number 9. The bear ward. If you think brutal sports are a modern invention, think again. In Tudor England, one of the most popular forms of entertainment wasn't jousting or swordplay, it was bear baiting. Crowds gathered by the hundreds to watch enormous, chained bears tear into packs of dogs for sport. And behind every bloody spectacle was a man called the bear ward. His job was to acquire, train, and manage these massive, furious animals, usually starting with cubs. Training, in this case, meant abuse. The bear ward would systematically starve, beat, and torment the bears to make them more aggressive and entertaining in the ring. Their teeth were filed down and claws clipped, not to protect anyone, but to ensure the fights lasted longer. On the day of a show, the bear ward would chain the bear to a post in the middle of the arena, then release the dogs one pack at a time. But his job didn't stop there. He had to stay in the ring, ensuring the chains held, replacing dead or injured dogs, and even prodding the bear with poles if it wasn't fighting hard enough. If the crowd wasn't entertained, it was his neck on the line, sometimes literally. The risks were immense. Bears, unlike dogs, remember pain and cruelty. There are several recorded cases of bear wards being mauled to death by their own animals, attacked during cleaning, feeding, or in the ring itself. These weren't mindless beasts, they were intelligent, powerful, and, after years of suffering, unpredictably vengeful. Some bear wards were found dead in their pits, torn apart by the very creatures they had raised. And yet the job persisted for generations. In some cases, the bear ward worked under royal patronage, especially during the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, both of whom loved bear baiting. But royal favor didn't make the work any less miserable. Feeding and housing giant predators, cleaning up after them, enduring the stench and fear, all while risking your life for someone else's amusement, it was a profession built entirely on violence, humiliation, and danger. Bear baiting was finally banned in 1835, ending centuries of blood sport, but the bear ward's legacy is a chilling reminder of what people were once willing to do and watch for the sake of entertainment. Number 8. The raker. Imagine the worst public restroom you've ever stepped into. Now multiply that filth across an entire city and remove the plumbing. That was Tudor London. With no proper sewage system, no garbage collection, and a population that believed windows were great places to empty chamber pots, the streets became a swamp of human waste, rotting food, dead animals, and ankle-deep filth. Enter the raker, the unfortunate soul whose job was to clean it up. Armed with long-handled rakes, shovels, and a cart that often leaked more than it carried, rakers trudged through the streets before dawn, scraping the sludge into heaps and hauling it to lay stalls on the outskirts of town. On a dry day, the grime might reach your boots. After heavy rain, it could swallow you up to the knees. But sludge wasn't the only hazard. People tossed their waste from upper windows without warning, sometimes directly onto the raker's head. Then there were the dead animals, dogs, cats, even bloated horses that had to be dragged or broken down where they lay. In summer, a dead horse could double in size from gases, and the moment a raker tried to move it, the carcass would rupture, showering them in hot flesh, maggots, and unspeakable stink. Pay was miserable, so many rakers supplemented their income by scavenging anything of value: coins, jewelry, bones, cloth, even meat scraps, pulling treasure from muck. But the risks went far beyond bad smells and flying filth. The streets were breeding grounds for disease. Plague, typhus, dysentery, if it was contagious, the raker breathed it in. Yet despite the revolting conditions, this was a necessary job. Without rakers, the entire city would have drowned in its own waste. There was no glamour, no recognition, just endless days of shoveling other people's refuse while the world looked away. Even as municipal sanitation slowly improved over the centuries, it was the Tudor-era raker who endured the worst of it, working thanklessly with nothing but a rake, a bucket, and a stomach of steel. They were the last line of defense between civilization and collapse, holding the city together one foul cartload at a time. Number 7. The Saltpetre Man. In Tudor England, gunpowder was power, and gunpowder needed saltpetre. The problem? England didn't have any natural deposits. So instead of mining it, the crown sent out men with royal warrants to rip it straight from the ground beneath people's homes. These were the Saltpetre Men, and their job was to collect nitrate-rich soil created by the decomposition of organic matter, urine, feces, rotting animal remains, by digging through floors and places like stables, chicken coops, pig pens, and, yes, even people's kitchens. They had legal authority to barge into any property, tear up the flooring, and cart off the filth underneath. You couldn't refuse them. They'd arrive with official papers and start wrecking your home on the spot. Stone floors, smashed. Wooden planks, uprooted. Furniture, shoved aside like garbage. And when they left, they didn't repair the damage. That was your problem, not theirs. Because they were paid by the amount of soil collected, not by the hour, they worked fast and rough, more scavengers than scientists. Unsurprisingly, they were universally despised. There are numerous accounts of furious homeowners attacking Saltpetre Men with anything they had on hand: shovels, hammers, even livestock. In some villages, entire mobs gathered to drive them out. But their royal backing made them nearly untouchable. They'd leave for a few weeks, then return with more soldiers and more warrants, ready to dig again. The irony is that most Saltpetre Men didn't understand chemistry. They just knew where that smelly earth formed, scooped it up, and left it to be refined elsewhere. Sometimes they dug up the wrong soil entirely, leaving damage without even fulfilling their purpose. Their work was loud, destructive, and deeply invasive, turning everyday households into temporary war zones. And yet, because gunpowder was critical for England's military strength, they were tolerated, grudgingly. The profession persisted into the 17th century, until England began importing saltpetre from India, making the home invasions and floor-raising raids obsolete. But for decades, the Saltpetre Man was a symbol of how far the state would go in the name of national defense, violating private homes, wrecking livelihoods, and leaving chaos behind, all in pursuit of the perfect explosive. Number 6. The Plague Searcher. Picture London in the grip of the Black Death, bodies piling up faster than they can be buried, the air thick with the stench of decay, and entire neighborhoods falling silent overnight. Amid this horror, the city devised a desperate solution: send elderly women door to door to confirm plague deaths. These women were known as plague searchers, and their qualifications were brutally simple: not medical training, not experience, but the grim expertise of having seen too many dead bodies. For a few copper pennies per corpse, they would enter plague-stricken homes, often with multiple deaths inside, and inspect the bodies up close, searching for the telltale signs: blackened fingers, swollen buboes, foaming blood at the mouth. They had no protective gear, no gloves, no masks, no coats, just their clothing, which absorbed every particle of the diseased air they walked through. They breathed it in, touched infected skin, and returned the next day to do it again. Unsurprisingly, most didn't live long. They were viewed with fear and suspicion. People believed they spread the plague themselves, carrying death from house to house. Families would lie, plead, or bribe them to declare a death as something, anything, other than plague. Why? Because a confirmed plague death meant your entire household was locked in, quarantined, sometimes boarded up with the living still inside. If the bribe failed, threats followed. Some searchers were beaten, others chased from homes or attacked in the street. And yet, despite the danger, many women took the job simply because they had no other choice. Widows, beggars, and the poor accepted this lethal task in exchange for a few coins and maybe a crust of bread. There was no honor in the work, no security, no future, just long days and longer nights surrounded by death. Their grim reports became part of the official bills of mortality, weekly summaries posted across the city that tallied the rising tide of the dead. The job persisted through successive plague waves, finally disappearing in 1836 when the government began requiring licensed medical practitioners to certify causes of death. But for nearly 2 centuries, the plague searcher stood as the last witness to thousands of lonely deaths, unprotected, uncelebrated, and often themselves doomed by the very bodies they were paid to inspect. Number 5. The Woad Dyer. If you've ever admired the deep blue color in medieval tapestries or royal garments, thank a Woad Dyer, and then immediately pity him. Woad, the plant used to produce blue dye in England before indigo imports, required a dyeing process so revolting, so toxic, that even Queen Elizabeth I banned it from within 5 miles of any royal residence. The procedure began by harvesting woad leaves, crushing them into a thick paste, and then fermenting that paste in large open baths. But fermentation didn't happen naturally, it required an accelerant. That's where stale human urine came in, collected from public jugs on street corners and chamber pots in alleyways. The woad paste would sit in urine for days, bubbling and reeking, until the dye was ready. The smell was indescribable, so strong and offensive that travelers claimed it made their eyes water before they reached the village. But the real suffering came to those who worked the vats. Woad dyers stood over the cauldrons for hours, stirring the mixture with long poles, their faces directly above the rising chemical fumes. The ammonia from the urine burned their lungs, their throats, and their eyes. Prolonged exposure caused permanent respiratory damage and even blindness. Their skin, soaked in dye and toxins, turned a sickly blue-green, staining them for life. Some collapsed from the fumes and fell in, drowning or suffering burns that left them permanently scarred. They worked nearly naked to keep their clothes from catching fire or becoming ruined by the corrosive dye, leaving their bodies even more exposed. The communities where Woad Dyers lived were often isolated, their residents shunned like lepers. Even other tradesmen who dealt with filth, like tanners or butchers, looked down on them. And yet, the job persisted for centuries, because blue dye was in high demand. Nobles loved it. Royal garments, banners, uniforms, all required the rich blue that only Woad could provide. Eventually, Woad was replaced by imported indigo, and the dyers faded into obscurity. But for hundreds of years, the vibrant color of power and nobility came from the labor of men who sacrificed their health, dignity, and often their lives to stir vats of rotting urine under open sky, living ghosts stained by the very color they helped create. Number 4. The Spit Boy. Deep in the roaring kitchens of Hampton Court Palace, where flames leapt and meat sizzled for King Henry VIII's legendary feasts, crouched the most expendable worker in the entire royal household, the Spit Boy. His job was as simple as it was hellish: turn the spit. That spit, of course, was a giant iron rod skewering whole oxen, deer, or boars, suspended over a roaring hearth that could reach temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Spit Boy, often a child no older than 7 or 8, would squat beside the fire, soaked in sweat, blistered from the heat, and crank the handle for hours on end to ensure the meat roasted evenly. If he stopped even for a moment, if fatigue overtook him, if he nodded off, if he simply blinked too long, he would be beaten by the head cook, who cared far more about the king's dinner than a burned child. The boys often worked naked or nearly so. Fabric posed a fire hazard, and garments would simply rot from constant exposure to heat, smoke, and grease. To protect their hands and faces, they wrapped themselves in wet rags, but those dried out in minutes and offered little protection. Pass out from heat exhaustion. Get doused with cold water and shoved back into place. During festivals or royal banquets, some Spit Boys worked 16 to 18 hours straight without rest. Blisters turned to burns, muscles seized, and bones ached from the constant grinding motion of the crank. There was no glory, no upward path, just endless days beside fire, roasting meat for nobles who never learned their names. Many of these children were orphans or desperately poor, forced into this grueling labor for a few coins and a crust of bread. The position finally disappeared in the 17th century with the invention of mechanical spit-turning devices, but for generations, the Spit Boy was a fixture of royal kitchens, unseen, unheard, and utterly consumed by fire and labor. While guests toasted the crown with overflowing goblets and feasted on perfectly roasted venison, a child was melting beside the flames, his skin scorched, his arms trembling, turning the meat that made the kingdom's glory possible. Number 3. The Fuller. Before a single thread of Tudor wool could become a fine cloak or gown, it had to be cleaned, and in the absence of soap or chemicals, the cleaning agent of choice was human urine. Enter the fuller, a worker tasked with transforming raw, oily fleece into soft, wearable fabric by stomping it for hours in vast tubs of stale, fermented pea. The process was as brutal as it sounds. Wool was soaked in urine collected from public jugs placed on street corners, then trampled repeatedly to break down the lanolin and impurities. But this wasn't a gentle process. Fullers, often barefoot and shirtless, would spend entire days standing waist-deep in sloshing, ammonia-rich filth, pressing and turning the wool with their feet and legs. The fumes alone were enough to make most people gag, so overpowering, in fact, that fullers were banned from living within city limits. The constant exposure to ammonia didn't just sting the eyes and nose, it burned the skin, ate away at the soles of their feet, and damaged the lungs. Many fullers developed chronic respiratory illnesses. Others were permanently scarred. And yet the work was so physically demanding that it often fell to the poorest, men, women, and even children as young as 6 or 7 who were tossed into the vats because their small bodies could navigate the heavy wool more easily. For hours on end, they stomped the fabric like grapes, their flesh raw, their noses filled with the sickly stench of rot and urine. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't safe, but it was essential. Every robe worn by nobility, every uniform, every merchant's cloak passed through the feet of a fuller. And because the wool industry was the economic backbone of Tudor England, these unseen workers kept the entire system running, quietly, painfully, and utterly without recognition. The introduction of fulling mills in later centuries finally brought relief, mechanizing the job and replacing human feet with water-powered hammers. But for hundreds of years, the fullers stood, literally and figuratively, knee-deep in human waste, stomping in silence so that someone else could walk in comfort and pride. Number 2, the groom of the stool. Of all the roles in Tudor England, none was more bizarre, or more coveted, than the groom of the stool. The title sounds like a joke, but it was very real, and it came with immense power and privilege. The job: to manage the king's toilet. Literally. The groom was responsible for the monarch's closed stool, a padded, portable toilet disguised as an ordinary piece of furniture. But this wasn't just about emptying a chamber pot. The groom of the stool personally attended the king during his most private moments, monitoring his diet, timing his bowel movements, and, yes, wiping the royal backside. And incredibly, this wasn't a position of humiliation, but honor. High-ranking nobles, even dukes and earls, fought for the role, not because they enjoyed the work, but because of what it gave them: unparalleled access. When you're the only person allowed in the room while the king is on the toilet, you're not just wiping, you're whispering. The groom became the king's confidant, political advisor, and gatekeeper, using the intimacy of the role to influence decisions, appointments, and royal favor. He kept meticulous records of the king's digestive health, including consistency, frequency, and color, documents that, astonishingly, still exist in British archives. But with power came discomfort. Imagine having to carry a royal commode from palace to palace, clean it daily, and remain on call every hour of every day in case His Majesty felt the urge. The job required absolute discretion, a strong stomach, and total devotion. There was no room for shame. And yet, the position was so important that the groom often rose to become one of the most powerful men at court. He could make or break careers with a whisper in the king's ear, sometimes while holding a linen cloth in his hand. The role gradually faded as plumbing improved and royal privacy became more sacrosanct, disappearing entirely by the end of the Stuart era. But for generations, the fate of nations may have been decided not in war rooms or parliament halls, but in a quiet chamber beside the king's toilet, where the groom of the stool stood ready, ever loyal, ever watchful, ever wiping. Number 1, the Gong Farmer. If hell had a night shift, the Gong Farmer would be working it. In Tudor England, before modern sewage systems existed, every home, tavern, and castle relied on cesspits, deep underground chambers where human waste accumulated over days, weeks, even months. Eventually, someone had to empty them. That someone was the Gong Farmer. The name Gong came from the Old English word for dung, and the job was exactly what it sounds like: shoveling excrement. But it wasn't just unpleasant, it was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire kingdom. Gong farmers worked only at night, not by choice, but by law. The stench was so overpowering that city ordinances banned them from operating during daylight hours. Armed with nothing but a shovel, a rope, and a lantern, they would climb down into cesspits, sometimes shoulder-deep in rotting human waste, surrounded by methane and hydrogen sulfide gases that could knock them unconscious, or kill them outright. Some never made it back out. The infamous Richard the Raker, for example, drowned in a pit after being overcome by fumes. Others passed out mid-shift and suffocated slowly, buried in the very thing they were paid to remove. And the pay? A few shillings per night, barely enough to live on, certainly not enough to justify the risk. After several hours of shoveling, Gong farmers had to haul the buckets of waste through the streets to the outskirts of town, where the contents were dumped in lay stalls or used as fertilizer. Covered in filth, they would push their dripping carts through alleys and past sleeping homes, hoping no one recognized them. Society needed them, but despised them. They were banned from certain churches, refused service in shops, and treated like walking disease. And yet, people took the job, because it was this, or starve. There was no glamour, no praise, just the crushing knowledge that your job was to descend into darkness, into filth, into death. The Gong Farmer was the invisible guardian of urban health, the one who kept Tudor cities from drowning in their own waste. With the rise of modern sanitation, the profession finally disappeared in the 19th century. But for over 400 years, it was the Gong Farmer, half man, half myth, all misery, who held back the flood of civilization's filth with nothing but a bucket and brute endurance. And that's the brutal truth, 12 real jobs from Tudor England that were less like employment and more like slow, daily torture. These weren't rare punishments or fringe occupations, they were necessary roles, carried out by ordinary people who had no better options. They labored in cesspits, stood in vats of urine, boiled human remains, and breathed in toxic fumes, not for glory or status, but for survival. Most earned barely enough to eat, lived in isolation, and died young, their suffering largely forgotten by the world they helped keep running. It's easy to wince or laugh in disbelief today, but every flush toilet, every clean street, every safe workplace exists because someone once did these jobs in the filth, by hand, and without protection. They were invisible back then, and in many ways they still are. But their stories deserve to be told, not just because they're shocking, but because they remind us how far we've come. So the next time you're stuck in a boring meeting or complaining about a long shift, remember, you're not scraping human waste by candlelight. You're not dodging wild dogs in a crowded church. You're not inhaling ammonia fumes until your skin burns blue. And for that, maybe today's job isn't so bad after all.